Welcome to the Serious Leisure podcast. My name is Petia Petrova and I'm the host of this podcast. You are about to listen to the very first episode we recorded. This was live at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and it was recorded in November 2020. This is how this podcast began. This is what our thinking was at the time, and this is what we tried to achieve. So for those of you who have listened before, you are about to uncover our origins. For those of you who are about to start their first Serious Leisure podcast listen, this is the right place. This is where it all started. We do hope that you enjoy, obviously like and subscribe. And we hope that this makes you think about how you balance leisure, work, and well-being in your life, and reflect on the challenges, the trials, tribulations, and successes. And we hope that this inspires you to rethink, if a rethink is needed, about how you balance leisure, work, and well-being, or to just give you a new insight to reflect on the place of leisure in your life. Enjoy. So thank you for joining us this Friday afternoon. I know everybody is very busy, and thank you for making the time for being part of this event. I'm really excited to welcome you to this. This is something we haven't quite done before, and it will be really interesting to see how this goes. This event is about stories, it's about fun, and it's about communities. And so if you allow me, I will start with a story of how we all came to be here. And it will be very brief. In April this year, during lockdown, as we were all sitting at home and trying to absorb what's happening, I was thinking about the trauma we were all suffering in different ways, emotional, physical. We were all asking ourselves some existential questions. And I was reflecting on when I had experienced physical and emotional trauma as a result of sudden illness. And I knew that I was very lucky that soon after I was able to find a hobby, an interest, a new community, and that was instrumental in my physical and mental recovery. In this case, and quite unlike my character, this was improvised theatre. So I got to wondering how we can learn and be inspired from each other, and by the interesting, impressive, and quirky and surprising pursuits that we're all finding. I was also well aware that for me, it took a major life event for an emergency surgery to not only find an interest outside of work, but also to allow myself the time to engage with it, to allow myself the time for leisure and for self-care and for rest. So only after illness into my 40s, I was able to put aside time for looking after myself and finding joy and feeling that that's something that is legitimate. So I decided that I'll try to do something with this idea. I didn't know what, so I reached out to a few colleagues in wellbeing, and I had numerous chats with Kat Branch, who I'm very grateful for joining us today. Kat is the leader of UWE Bristol Centre for Music. And our conversations led us to thinking about sharing stories for fun, leisure communities. And we thought this is a great idea. But we also thought what might be very interesting is to frame this concept around the concept of serious leisure. This is a field of social science research, and we thought that would give us a language to talk about leisure pursuits, an evidence base to learn from, and see how our stories and anecdotes are reflected on it or not. I had a very broad awareness of the concepts. Kat had engaged with serious leisure throughout her professional life. But we just needed an expert. We had to find an expert who is thoroughly and fully versed in this topic. So an expert to join us in this endeavor. I have from a long time ago a background in tourism studies. So I reached in some colleagues from the leisure field. And in doing so, I realized that Sam, with whom I've worked with over 10 years ago, has since written a book on this very topic with Professor Stebbins, who is the founding father, really, of the serious leisure field of research. I spoke to Sam, and I was extremely grateful that he not only agreed to engage with this, but he was instrumental in a lot of our pre-meetings from today. He's joining us today from University of Sam. Would like to introduce yourself?
Teesside, yeah.
University of Teesside, and he's very excited about our conversation today. So, as I said, this would be in conversation. And we'll start with Sam and Kat engaging in conversation with each other. In the meantime, you're all welcome to use the chat to share your thoughts, your ideas, to pose any questions. And once we have finished with the segment where Kat and Sam engage in conversation, we'll all engage in conversation together. Can I just get a general thumbs up that we're all happy and understanding what's happening today? You can also put thumbs up in the chat if your camera is off. Savannah, I assume that was a thumbs up as opposed to question.
Yes, it was.
Super.
I found the thumbs up emoji now.
Thank you. Excellent. Oh, and I need to mention that there's a sound of bubbles in the background, and that is because Kat has an aquarium in the background. So we haven't put any relaxing tunes in the background. That's just what the bubbling is about. So if you're wondering what that is. So Sam and Kat, welcome. Welcome to this afternoon. We had discussions about where we start this conversation today, but I just wondered how you felt about doing this today, this week. I know you were very excited in anticipation, but with everything that's currently happening, how do you feel today spending an hour talking about leisure?
Do you mind if I go first, Sam?
Absolutely, Kat, crack on.
It's funny, it's kind of an irony because I have found this week one of the most challenging since the pandemic started, in all honesty, and have felt a huge amount of pressure. And yesterday morning I was looking at this slot and thinking it's just something else I've got to do, and feeling quite stressed. And it's ironic really, because actually as I processed what was happening and remembered actually the conversations that Petia and I had had, and some of the really brilliant chats that Sam and I had had while we were preparing for these sessions, which actually I found really energizing and interesting and really fun, I realized that this wasn't going to be a burden. This was going to be actually a really enjoyable time, which is really in many ways for me a microcosm of what the leisure discussion is, and about how we position what we're doing, and how we label it and how we see it. So it's been an interesting week, and I landed in a place of really looking forward to this time, and seeing it in many ways as an expansion of my own leisure activities. So
yeah, it's really interesting. I think we share the fact that this week's been pretty stressful. I mean, again, I would probably couch it in terms of I've had a very reactionary week this week, so I've been fighting fires, as I no doubt everybody has. It's interesting to hear you say that you're looking at this time that we're spending together today, and you've been looking forward to it. And I think it is just making that time, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. My role at Teesside is a central learning and teaching role, but I spend most of my time, outside of all the strategic work and the managerial stuff, all the boring stuff over there. Most of my time is spent talking with staff, coaching staff, if you like. And very often we end up, I think purposefully, probably on my part because of my background, and which we'll probably get into, is I try and we're trying to have a contextualized conversation, and it's been a really, really interesting time over the last 7 or 8 months to be talking to staff, and obviously everybody's working kind of like this and like this, aren't they, in terms of 6 inches in front of their faces and just kind of reacting and living day to day. And I've certainly felt my role, not just this week, but over the last months, has been one of trying to create provide, I guess, a bit of perspective on things, and to bring conversations to not just the work they have to do, but, you know, in the context of, well, what else does that, you know, what else do you want to be doing, you know, in the context of their broader lives, I guess, in terms of lifestyle. And the lifestyle has been a real interesting topic for conversation. Everybody's feeling overworked and stressed and all of that kind of stuff, but trying to bring some perspective. And I felt that, you know, I as all of us no doubt have been doing, but, you know, I've struggled over the last, you know, 7 or 8 months to juggle the work-life kind of equation through a time of pandemic and lockdown. And it's interesting, I was reading something, I think it was yesterday, on it was one of the higher education websites I was just perusing, as I do in my spare time, or not. And it was this idea of what's transpired is this concept of work-life merge. And you know, for example, I finish work today, I turn around, and the only disconnect I have between my place of work and my house, my place of living, is a door. You know, and it's, whereas ordinarily I'd have a 45-minute commute and all that. So that the fact that we're not able to detach, to create distance, the merging of that has been a real challenge. And I think that's certainly come out. It comes out naturally in people's conversations at work. So I think this event, I mean, when Petia first reached out, I was obviously very excited. I mean, opportunity to talk about serious leisure at any point, I think, is a good one. So, and as you're going to realise today, Kat and myself can certainly talk about serious leisure. But I think it's a timely one, and I think that for 2 reasons really. Firstly, I think in a time of disruption, I think we need to be reminded, but also you know, in terms of what matters most to us. And really, that's the point here. For me, that's my in for this conversation is, and if there's any takeaway from today, it's, you know, it's a question from me to you, and that is, you know, what does matter most in this balance of work and life? You know, what role for leisure in that for you? And I think, you know, we've all struggled with that. I take health and fitness very seriously. I'm also very, very routinized in my work. So to have disruption at the level that we've experienced over the last 7 or 8 months has been a step change for me, having to find pockets of time as opposed to being able to craft, you know, big chunks of time perhaps for myself. And obviously the homeschooling of 2 small boys has been interesting as well. So I think for me, this is a timely conversation. I'm excited to have this conversation, but I was just talking to Kat prior to starting, how, you know, we've been leisure studies as a area of work and research, which we'll get into, has been around for 40 years. And actually over that time, the amount of theorizing that's gone on, obviously it's shifted and changed with the times, but I really feel quite strongly that a lot of that theorizing is coming to fruition now in terms of providing a mirror and a lens to broader work-life balance and challenges. So hopefully we can bring a bit of that to bear on the conversation today. So yeah, really, really timely, really excited to be here. And I do think, you know, as a concept and as a vehicle, you know, these types of conversation really does have legs in my mind, you know, in terms of it just being it's important to craft time to have the conversation about ourselves, but also more importantly, share those experiences with others.
Brilliant. Petia, you're on mute, I think.
We had a conversation about around the vein of what you both were talking about, that this is both the best and the worst time to be talking about leisure. It's the best time because it's actually even more important that we seriously consider that, and obviously the worst time for all that you both outlined. But we also talked about the language of leisure how sometimes there is almost negative connotation, or there's guilt attached to talking about leisure. And we had long discussions about, and I'm sure colleagues who've chosen to attend today would have made such considerations, would have thought about how they talk to others about attending this event, or if they've chosen to share that they're attending today and they've put aside time to talk about leisure. So I was just wondering if we can start unpacking and digging into some of the concepts about leisure and some of the difficulties of the language of leisure that can also be an impediment to us being open about engaging with leisure and talking about our leisure pursuits.
Yes, because I think it's interesting, because I feel one of the main barriers we all face making time to do things that aren't work and that aren't other obligations, aren't other things that we must do, or that our family commitments oblige us to do, is that we feel somehow that those activities aren't important, and so they're supposedly in this leftover time or this surplus time. But then most of us would feel that surplus time is a fiction, right? So then you do actually have to carve out a line for that activity and commit to doing it, right? And I don't know how anyone else has found this experience, especially during the pandemic, where, as Sam was describing, your kind of exit from your workplace is a step through a door. In my case, it's literally nothing. I have to work from my dining room with my lovely fish. And this is also where all my musical instruments reside, and also where I do all my producing and creative work. And it's interesting that being here and having to work here means that I've found it very hard to create here. I've hardly played the piano at all. It's been quite difficult. And in my mind, a lot of that has been about thinking, yeah, but I've just got so much work to do. And when I'm in this space now, I feel that I must be working because there's so much to do. So I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about what this notion of serious leisure means. What is that wording about? To try to put some legs on the idea that leisure actually is important enough for us to set aside time for it, because this is a kind of mantra I have to repeat to myself when I feel exhausted and burning out and I'm not making that time, is believing that in fact it's essential and it's okay. It's not, I'm not skiving off work, I'm not doing a bad job. I'm not letting the family down by taking time to do something else. And so hopefully talking about why we might use the language of serious leisure might help us all justify those decisions and get over some of those psychological barriers.
Yeah, no, really interesting point. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. In terms of, if we look at the, specifically the discourses around leisure, the language that's used, you've got the mainstream, leisure discourse, which, is inherently interconnected with ideas of consumption and, mass leisure. Tourism's an extension of that, Petia, as you know, and a lot of this, what's really interesting about that whole kind of conversation is that there's so much of leisure that is just taken for granted. So that there's a taken for grantedness to leisure, the leisure experience, and I think, and a mindlessness to that as well. It's so interconnected with work, consumption, productivity, all of these different ideas. But and Kat's already mentioned here about this idea of what's left over. So I was noting some thoughts down last night, just looking at, reminding myself of some of the kind of leisure theory on which to hang this broader conversation, and there's a couple of main areas, in terms of the discourse. The first one is that, the residual nature of leisure. It's what's left over when we've completed all our work and obligated activities. So Wednesday night I had football training twice because both boys had training one after the other. That meant we didn't really get back until, this was the last time before lockdown, by the way, so we absolutely made the most of it. But we didn't get in until 7 p.m. I was working from 7:30 a.m. And then all of a sudden, the day's gone. And it's that residual nature. There's also the personal enrichment side of leisure. So people pursuing certain leisure pursuits because it enriches their own sense of self and identity, and we'll get into the idea of mastery, no doubt, in terms of being able to, for example, play a musical instrument and whatnot. But there's also a voluntary nature to that. Kat mentioned the idea of choice. Choice is central to the idea of leisure. It's Bob Stebbins calls it uncoerced. The idea is there's a sense of agency in leisure, and that is a sense of agency on the point of, well, I choose to take this activity forward. I do so in the time that I've crafted for myself. But also, leisure is inherently interconnected also with how we see ourselves. So there's a sense of identity in that as well. And you can hear it in how Kat's talking about, the role music plays in her life. It's also an extension of her work life as well. So the lines are blurred, and they become blurred in this modern, or postmodern, if you like, conception of leisure that we live in today. There's no easy divide. It's not an either or. It's not on a spectrum in any way. It's part and it's choice, but it's a choice. It's a lifestyle choice, and that's why it's such a messy concept. It's so very difficult to nail down, because we all live life differently. Although we might be consuming leisure in similar ways, it has different roles to play in our lives, and it really then boils down to, it's a value proposition, isn't it? What's the value of leisure? So I just to sketch over some of the language there in terms of the different ways that we can look at this idea of leisure.
Yeah, on that, Sam, I was thinking it might be helpful for anyone who's in the session who's not familiar with Stebbins's work, or even the expression serious leisure, frankly, whether it might be quite helpful for us to just briefly lay out what the proposition is in terms of the differences between serious leisure and casual leisure. Because at an outside view, you could take the impression that serious leisure is like real leisure that matters and has value, and casual leisure is some crappy leisure that doesn't matter, like Netflix or having a cigarette break, But actually, I think Stebbins is quite careful to avoid that kind of false valuing. Even though these are quite different categories. Do you think maybe you could just sum up for everybody what we mean by these two things?
Yeah, no problem. It's only taken 50 books and hundreds of articles to unpack this, but I'll have a go.
2 sentences, Sam. Or
In 2 sentences, you've got no chance. I implore everybody to have a read of it. It doesn't have to be the book that Bob and I wrote together, but it's quite an accessible term and accessible framework, which I think is the allure of the idea of serious leisure in the first place. It's got its critics, but what it does do, it gives us a framework and a series of lenses and mirrors to look at our daily lives, and we can all see ourselves in it, which I think is one of the great attractions. So the serious leisure perspective is actually a broader umbrella term for what there are 3 component parts to it from a serious angle. You also got its counterpart, which is casual leisure. Now, it'd be very easy for us to sit here and go, right, well, leisure, and this is one of the criticisms, leisure is either or, right? You're either casual or you're taking it seriously. Well, it's not quite that simple. Otherwise we'd have a very clear idea of what leisure is, and we wouldn't be having this conversation at all.
Quite. I think normally our journeys are a bit of a mishmash, aren't they?
Well, they are, and I think that's Bob's point. Bob's point is it's a package deal here. It's not an either or. It's this is lived out individually for people. So the serious leisure, in terms of serious leisure, Bob couches this in terms of serious pursuits. So there's a different makeup depending on what activities you're doing. But the serious leisure are those pursuits that are undertaken in your leisure time. So those uncoerced activities you feel unobligated in terms of time, but it's a choice that you take to pursue this. But you do so in a serious manner, and the seriousness of leisure in this perspective is around the application of time, the perseverance over time as well, and the development of certain skills and knowledge attached to certain roles and activities. So a good example, there's 3 main areas within that. So you've got amateur pursuits, you've got hobbyists, and you've got volunteer pursuits. And I think if we were all looking at our own leisure, we could probably see ourselves in at least one of those things. So I'll take Kat as a perfect living, breathing example here of, you know, there's an amateur, but also a professional. And this is really interesting where the interrelationship comes in. You know, the amateur, you're our amateur because they're our professional counterpart. So the reason why the concept is in existence at all is because you've got that professional counterpart. So amateur theatre, amateur music, amateur, you get the idea. The hobbyist is, you know, those people that do craft time, but tend to craft time for activities which are, I mean, it might even be crafting, for example, is a perfect example of a hobbyist activity. There's also some health and fitness in there as well. The voluntary is, as you might imagine, you know, there's serious volunteers, and I put into this category those people that maybe volunteer through clubs and volunteer through. So I've in my own research, we looked at voluntary sports coaches, for example. You know, those people that give up inordinate amounts of time to activities that it's an extension perhaps of a professional interest, but actually it's done in their own free time. And again, it's that uncoerced, unobligated time. So you've got those three areas within the serious pursuits category of the serious leisure perspective. That then correlates with a second, and that's the project-based leisure. And project-based leisure is those short-term, one-off or occasional activities or undertakings that people do. A really great example that I love about this is that's been given is wedding planning, right? So you might employ somebody to wedding plan for you, in which case that's not, but you might do this yourself, or you might bring in a family member and a family member might offer to do that. So this idea of project-based leisure is another aspect of that. And then we come to the casual forms of leisure. Now, when the term was first developed, there was two seminal conceptual statements written by Bob. The first one was serious leisure, and the second was casual leisure. And unfortunately, what that set up was this dichotomy, and it's anything but. But the casual leisure, you know, to give you an example, would be the like watching television, watching Netflix, those short-term, pleasurable, even hedonistic experiences that we all seek as maybe an escape for, you know, other aspects of life, but don't necessarily lead to the longer term engagement and rewards that serious leisure does. So in serious leisure, we tend to craft what's known as a leisure career, you know, so we end up going on a bit of a trajectory of mastery, skills development, knowledge on and through those particular pursuits. In casual leisure, we just don't have that. It's short-term, short-lived, but there is a pleasurable component to it. So that's all that coming together and that hanging together under the umbrella of the serious leisure perspective. And what it is, it's a mirror and a lens to our work, life, leisure balance. And Bob actually suggests that there is such a thing as an optimal leisure lifestyle. And that is not a universal or pervasive thing. It's something we all work out for ourselves. And as Kat rightly points out, it's a mix, and probably a messy mix at that, and it doesn't stand still. But we're all constantly trying to find this mix that works best for us. And you throw a global pandemic and that magnitude of disruption in there, it becomes quite an interesting thing to think about. So Kat, I don't know if you want to expand on any of that.
Yeah, I think for me, what I wanted to pick up on for just thinking about people who are with us today is that it still can be a little tricky, I think, with some of the language. I don't know how some of you felt listening to Sam speaking there, but it's quite difficult trying to quantify the types of leisure activity that we do and to understand them in these terms. Stebbins' description of the sort of that serious leisure amateur, that is a sort of aspiring professional, someone looking at what a professional is doing. But you know, we're stuck with the fact that is slightly loaded in our culture, isn't it? And so we think we're kind of basically saying that we're not very good at what we do. Is where we end up with, or even though actually understanding what we're talking about, a kind of a professional aspiration approach to what we're doing is, on the other hand, a quite helpful concept. And the same as we might think by calling the time that we're making for crafting a hobbyist accidentally again diminishes it. This again is a problem within our culture. not within Sevens's theories, where we'll then say, oh, well, it's a hobby, so I don't really want to make time for that. But in fact, it's just a way of understanding the different behaviours that we do. What I think it's helpful for us to touch on would be the recognised benefits of these kinds of activities. So whether it is that casual leisure type activity, which is much more about that instant pleasure moment and the kind of getting a relief, and this includes social media, toxic though it is, it's those kinds of things, but it's not necessarily all bad. Many of us start the kind of more serious leisure pursuits with a bit of casual leisure, right? Go to sing along in a choir for a bit and then eventually start to develop your singing skills. But I think it'd be helpful to talk about why we should even bother. What is the evidence that this is giving us any benefit, and why we should be trying to prioritise it.
It's a really, again, this is, I mean, the challenge of studying leisure as a concept, again, is that it's depending on how you're looking at it. I mean, we're talking before we went live about the different ways that leisure has been studied, and if you were to come at it from what would be, I guess, a European or a UK centric perspective, it tends to be more social, cultural and critical theory. So contextualizing that within, state and its relationship and all that kind of stuff. In the North America, and South America, you're talking about it's couched as leisure science. It's very individualistic, and there you've got things like self-actualization and all those different types of concepts. So the benefits are many and varied, but in terms of what's been researched and what's been focused on through the lens of leisure, serious leisure, there's a number of personal and social benefits that have been shown. So self-actualization is in there, so realizing your own potential or different potential through different leisure pursuits. And Kat's absolutely right when she says that casual leisure can be a hook to more serious forms of leisure. Yeah, so I encourage everybody that's listening now, although hopefully I'm turned off already, listening now, and to think about your own leisure and how you got involved in it, how those the more serious types of leisure perhaps that you're maybe not so involved right now, but those that you've been involved maybe in the past or continue to be involved in now. How did you start out? How did you start out in that pursuit, in that particular leisure pursuit? And if it's if you've persevered over time, and you go back again and again and again to that leisure activity, to that pursuit, then there's a good chance that casual hook, it was just something to do, or a friend invited me down, or I just wanted to do different something. And then you go, actually, no, this is really interesting. Oh, hold on a minute. I'm actually quite good at this. Oh, right. OK. And I like the environment and the community and the sense of belonging. And all of a sudden, so I'm seeing Petia nod there. It's probably aligning with what you were doing in terms of your improvisational work. I've certainly found that in some of the different activities that I've pursued over the years. How we end up pursuing different forms of leisure is different for all of us, but there's a certain trajectory there which tends to start out as on a casual level, but we tend to see certain benefits play out, whether that be like the actualization of our potential that maybe we did or didn't know, or the self-fulfillment of goals that we set ourselves. And on the social side, you've got that sense of attachment and belonging. These serious pursuits tend to have their own social worlds and ethos. And that's something we buy into, and they become extensions of our own identity, which is really quite interesting. So just in all of that, if we took a moment to think about our own leisure and go, okay, how did I start there? Why have I, and more importantly, why am I still doing it? And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have with ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I think also because motivation ebbs and flows, doesn't it? Yeah. I know at the, working at the Centre for Music, it's very interesting watching people's motivation patterns ebb and flow. And there'll be periods where we may see students and staff having a real surge in their commitment and their time and satisfaction. And then when there isn't enough energy to bring that more serious leisure approach, people either fade away completely or just drop in for a casual whatever. Interestingly, the more communal activities have much less ebb and flow because of those structures you were talking about. And so when we're doing those, when we're doing those leisure activities with other people, and so we have an identity with a certain choir or the orchestra or the jazz band, and you're then this meaning making going on with what you're doing with those individuals. And also because on my side, all the general interesting areas of health research about group music making and the effects on social cohesion, that those actually are much more sustainable. From my perspective, this has been the major disruption to important leisure activity from the pandemic. And I don't know how anyone else has found this whose leisure activity has a strong social element, that ripping that context away is very painful, and in many ways can really pull the rug out from what has been a very meaningful serious leisure commitment, because you can't connect. I don't know, Petia, doing improv theatre, how do you do that if you can't see people face to face? How do you get the chemistry going? It's quite difficult.
But this is actually a good point to kind of get us all in. But just to answer the question, I spend a lot of time doing Zoom improv, but also the community and the kind of the friendships and the WhatsApp groups and the conversations have kind of really helped me to survive lockdown and the isolation of working and living from home. So we were lucky, although it took me a good 3 months to start enjoying doing improv on Zoom. But it needed some perseverance, and it was interesting that some of the kind of the wider community, some stuck to it and some just couldn't quite transition into that environment. And I wonder how others would. I think this is a really good time to bring everybody on board into this conversation, and how others have experienced. Those of you who have leisure pursuits, do you think this is leisure? Do you have any, this is serious leisure? Do you have any questions you would like to pose to Kat and Sam?
Just people are thinking there as well.
Pardon?
Just people are thinking about that. I mean, just something that occurred to me just now as Kat and yourself were talking, something that we haven't got onto, but I have spent quite a bit of time writing about and researching, is this idea of the attachment of certain activities to different types of space. So the disruption, the disconnect, the rupture of the the social attachment to people, yes, but most leisure activities are, particularly the serious pursuits, are attached to certain physical spaces.
Yeah, to geography, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. So, but through our activities, through the work that we do, using the term work, the work that we do in that space with others and building those connections and developing ourselves and attaching ourselves to those spaces, they become places, meaningful spaces for meaningful activities. And I think that for me has been one of the most difficult things to navigate over the past 7 years. We all recognized immediately the absence of the social. Yeah, that's immediately kind of felt. It's a felt thing with social beings. But over time, for me personally, the absence of designated place that I've built a sense of self and expertise within, in terms of the health and fitness realm and playing team sports and all these different kinds of things. So I think it's really, really, it is a complex of different tensions in there. So I just wonder whether, thinking about this as people are thinking about their own, to be thinking about the spaces and places in which they engage in the leisure that they do is something, and just another way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to know how people are approaching that. Even in the micro at home, when I was talking about the difficulties of my dining room, which is also my music room, becoming now also my workspace, that experience has polluted the ability of this space to be my creative space, because it was a kind of sacred space and it was set aside. But because this is the best internet place in my house, here I work, and I find it very, very difficult to experience that kind of going into my creative closet that has been the rest of my life as a musician. So I'm trying some different approaches where I'm trying to make little corners in my home where I would never work and planting instruments there. But it's a bizarre and difficult process, and I'd be interested to know how other people in the session are approaching that when you're stuck in your home, or if you can't even get to your spaces.
So let's get a bit of a feeling where people are at. So we have a text from a couple of chats. Sorry, a couple of comments from Helga and Heather in the comments box. So Helga talks about she agrees with the importance of place. I struggle with the overlap of using technology all day at work and then doing some Zoom choir rehearsals. Sometimes it feels like work. And that constant, obviously, engagement with the screen. And then Heather talks about she started serious solo travel, and then obviously traveling has been a huge, important part of her identity and the way she spent leisure, and that's been and the other main interest being the cinema.
You were Heather, you cycled to Bitton for 4 nights. That's amazing. Yeah,
yeah, it was that important to get away. And I could get there and back in one night, you know, there was no problem with transport. I didn't have to get on a bus or a train.
No, do you know, it's interesting because Sam and I haven't really touched on the aspect of escapism associated with leisure. We didn't get a chance to talk about that today particularly. But I feel that is very pertinent, especially for working people. You know, so much of what we're doing, I think it's why we often end up with casual leisure, not always the healthiest casual leisure choices, you know, because we're so desperate to escape.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the escapism, I think it's certainly stark reality right now, isn't it? Given what's going on, obviously we're in lockdown again, and you know the need to escape. You know, we have a very narrow set of options, really, don't we? Do you know what really does strike me in the conversation though is how and just the way that Kat's been talking, and the way you can hear in the text there, is I feel that maybe what we're having to be is a little bit more creative in how we think about, you know, and really in that decision making process. We're having to be creative because we feel that this is important to us. So, you know, it's that what matters most conversation I mentioned at the start. And if it does matter most to us, we will find ways of crafting time and space in order to pursue it. Probably not in the ways that we would obviously prefer or like, but what's going to be interesting is that what are those leisure pursuits that we continue post-pandemic, and what do they look like? Yeah, so what have we shed in terms of our leisure pursuits? What have we maintained over the course of the lockdown? You know, how have they developed and changed? These are all really, really interesting conversations. We're all feeling the same tensions, but we're all coping and adapting in slightly different ways. Has your leisure been your coping strategy? Is another interesting thing to think about. So I hear in what Heather's writing there is an absolute resounding yes. You know, the fact, you know, it has been a coping strategy to get away, physically distance yourself from, you know, your place of work, which happens to be where you live, and to be somewhere different, a different place, but doing something you're passionate about. It's really interesting.
Has anybody else been able to do that? Been able to use their leisure to escape during this time in an effective way?
It always takes a couple of seconds for colleagues to write. You don't have to write in the chat. You can just switch your audio or your video on, depending on whether you're happy to your contribution to be captured. I find it interesting. Laura, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say absolutely. Although for me, my hobbies have been fairly unaffected by the pandemic because I sew and I knit and stuff. It's quite solo anyway, but there's an enormous sewing community on Instagram, and the number of comments I've seen from people saying this has really got me through because all other aspects of my life have changed, but I've still got my sewing and I've still got the sewing community. But I'm lucky because I've got a separate room to work and a separate room to sew, and so I can completely understand that if you've got a conflict between the uses of the space you occupy, that would be really difficult. So I totally get that. But yes, it has been for me.
So it's really interesting. They're the core activity there. That's what Bob Stebbins talks about, is every serious leisure pursuit, and I would certainly class what you're talking about there, Laura, as a serious pursuit. You know, quilting's been captured in the in the hobbyist category of serious leisure, for example, and as a sewing. But the core activity there is something that you've built a repertoire around. But yeah, it's just for me, just in that that whole thing about space. There's other activities, for example, which require different types of spaces.
Yeah, it gives that sense of escape, doesn't it? Interestingly, it's only in the pandemic, the first time in 4 years, I started running again. I'm sort of a very cliche musician in that way, and I hate sports, generally speaking. Much love and respect, Sam. It's just because I'm very unfit. But the situation drove me to it because I couldn't find any solace in my music. So I try something else.
Mindful that Helga wants to come in as well.
I was just going to tell you can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, good. I was just going to tell you a funny little anecdote because my office is in my son's bedroom upstairs, and there was a particular Saturday morning probably where I'd had a really hard week. I was quite stressed out. I was still tired and grumpy, and for some reason I was downstairs with the whole family. They were being noisy. I just wanted some peace and quiet. So my partner says, just go upstairs. And I literally burst into tears because I can't go upstairs. I work upstairs. This is the weekend. I need to have space down here. Yeah. So the whole finding finding how the space works for everybody is that's been a bit of a challenge. And we're being creative. We're finding new ways to do things, I think.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, an anecdote for me. So me going for a run, me working, I do that outside. Right, in any weather. I'll take my gear outside, or I'll do it in the garden or whatever, and I'll do that quite religiously. What happened over lockdown was my two boys are 8 and 5. The 8-year-old's quite active, as all 8-year-old boys are, and he started to ask whether he could come and work out with me, and I was like, well, firstly I was like, no, absolutely not. This is my sacred space. But then obviously they weren't getting a lot of exercise during lockdown. So I thought, so we ended up, he cycled while I ran, or he came for a run with me. And unfortunately, that completely destroyed my confidence because my 8-year-old outran me, but that's neither here nor there. But it's really interesting how, what we've found, or certainly what I've found, is the familial space has kind of seeped into that kind of personal leisure space. And again, the divide there is become blurred.
So this
out of necessity, obviously, but yeah.
We've only scratched the surface. There's so much to unpack, particularly in the current day and age. And as Sam alluded to, this has been such an important but also complex concept anyhow. So the way we're going to do this in the future 2 episodes we have scheduled is we're going to have colleagues like yourselves coming and just sharing their experiences with engaging with serious leisure. Their motivation, their career trajectories within the leisure, their leisure identities, their communities, but also how COVID has impacted them. So we have 3 colleagues coming who are currently engaged with Centre for Music during our next podcast. And for our 3rd podcast, we're looking for volunteers of colleagues who would like to just share with us their experiences. So the way the podcast 2 and 3 would work is we're going to start with your story, with your experiences. You might get a few questions from Kat and Sam to really try to unpack your experience, and we're going to continue to have this community and shared conversation about how we have adapted and the drawbacks from COVID, but there are also some benefits. So in my case, my community have expanded beyond Bristol because we have been on Zoom, and expanded into for example, women who would normally have childcare responsibility, who would have not found time for this, have now found time for this. So there's this, with everything else, there's drawbacks and there's opportunities. And we're going to explore these over the next 3 months. I think this is all. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to stay and chat if you have a few minutes, or to put a comment in the chat. And I look forward to seeing you in a month's time.